Somewhere on the ocean tonight, there is a ship that isn't going anywhere in particular. Picture it. Lights on the deck, the hum of engines holding position, black water in every direction out to a horizon you can't see. And underneath the hull, a sound is going out, a pulse, aimed straight down into 4 kilometers of dark. The crew are waiting for it to come back. When it does, a machine will draw one thin line on a map of the seafloor. One line, because most of that map is still empty. This is the strange fact people forget about the planet they live on. We have photographed the far side of the moon. We have driven vehicles across Mars and mapped its craters and canyons in detail, and the floor of our own ocean, 70% of the surface of this world, has only been properly charted in about a quarter of its area. In 2017, the figure was 6%. 6. There is more unmapped ground beneath the water tonight than there is dry land on Earth. Now hold that in your mind, and come back about 2,000 years to a man writing in Aramaic about a journey he says he was taken on. His name is Enoch, and in the 60th chapter of the book that carries his name, he describes something being done to the world at the very beginning, not a creation, but a separation. On that day, the text says, 2 monsters were parted from one another. One of them, a female named Leviathan, was sent to dwell in the depths of the sea, above the springs of the waters. The other, a male named Behemoth, was placed in a desert on the far side of the garden. 2 enormous living things, divided at the start of the world, and put where they could not reach each other, one under the water, one under the sky. And then Enoch does what you would do. He asks the angel beside him to show him what these creatures actually are, how strong they are, and how they were separated, and why. And the angel says no. You seek to know what is hidden. That is the answer he gets. In a book that will happily walk him through the storehouses of the snow, the gates of the sun, the prison of the fallen stars, the chambers where the dead are waiting. In a book whose entire purpose is to show a human being the things nobody is supposed to see. This is one of the very few places where the guide simply refuses. The tour has exactly one locked door, and it is at the bottom of the sea. Remember that? The guide said no. We come back to it at the very end of the night. So tonight we go down there anyway, slowly, in the dark, with the sonar pinging. What does the Book of Enoch actually say is sealed beneath the ocean? Why is one of them female? A detail no earlier text contains and no scholar can fully explain. What is the ancient world so certain is down there that 4 different civilizations wrote it down? And what does the book say finally happens to them, which is not a battle and is not what anyone expects? Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word tonight. This is a long, slow descent, and you can let go at any depth. That's exactly right. Some nights you'll drift in and out of this, and that is not failing. That is what the deep does. It takes you down in stages, a little further each time. You don't need to arrive anywhere. You don't need to stay awake. This is for the ones who look at a dark sea and feel the size of it. For anyone who has ever stood at the edge of the water at night and understood, in a way you couldn't quite explain, that something was underneath. For the ones who look at a horizon and want to know what's past it. For anyone who has ever wondered what's beneath the surface, of the ocean, of a text, of the official version of things. For quiet minds who like their questions slow and their answers uncertain, you are exactly in the right place. I'm curious where you are tonight, and what hour it is where you are. Someone in Tokyo watching the first pale light gather at the window. Someone in London in the small hours. Someone in Brazil who has been meaning to sleep for an hour now and cannot quite get there. Someone on the coast, listening to something that may actually be the ocean. Leave it in the comments below. I read them in the mornings, and I think about the geography you're all carrying. And if tonight's descent is something you'd like to find again, A gentle tap on the like button tells the algorithm to bring you more. Entirely optional. Settling in here is already more than enough. Let's start with what's actually down there. Not with the text, not with the monsters, with the floor itself. Because before we can understand why an ancient book was so certain something was sealed in the deep, we have to sit with just how deep the deep is, and how little we've seen of it. The average depth of the ocean is 3,688 meters. That number doesn't fit easily into the imagination, so let's translate it. It's the height of roughly 12 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other, end to end, pointing straight down into the dark. It's about the altitude at which commercial aircraft begin their cruising descent, except that down there, in place of thin, cold air, there is black water under enormous pressure. No light, no warmth, no breathable atmosphere, just the weight of the ocean above it, pressing down. And the average is not the bottom. At the very deepest point, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific, the sea floor reaches 10,900 meters below the surface, nearly 11 kilometers of water. The Challenger Deep is named for HMS Challenger, a British Royal Navy corvette, converted into a research vessel, which first sounded it in 1875 by lowering a weighted hemp rope into the dark. The rope went down for over 8 kilometers before it touched bottom. The crew pulled it back up. They couldn't believe the number. They measured it again. The pressure at that depth is approximately 1,086 times the atmospheric pressure at the surface. If you were to carry an ordinary unopened styrofoam coffee cup down to the Challenger Deep, and researchers have done exactly this, attaching cups to the outside of remotely operated vehicles, it would come back the size of a thimble. The air inside the foam is crushed out of existence by the water pressure. The cup returns dense, hard, shrunken to a fraction of its former volume. Perfect evidence of what those depths do to things that don't belong there. The deepest zone, everything below 6,000 meters, is called the Hadal Zone. The name comes from the Greek Hades, the underworld. The connection is not decorative. The scientists who named it were aware of what they were invoking, the part of the world that belongs to the dark, that is beyond the living, that receives nothing from the surface and returns nothing to it. The Hadal Zone is where the trenches are, where the seafloor has folded over millions of years under the weight of tectonic collision into great downward gashes, the Mariana, the Tonga, the Philippine, the Kermadec, each one a canyon in the ocean, dropping to depths no surface creature was ever meant to reach. Some of the sediment at the bottom of the Challenger Deep has been accumulating undisturbed since before the first human being stood upright. The finest particles, clay minerals, the shells of microscopic organisms, the slow rain of organic matter from the surface, settle at the rate of about a centimeter every 1,000 years. The mud at the bottom is a geological archive. It has been there longer than our species, and we barely know it. We have sent more people to the surface of the moon than to full Hadal depth in a crewed vehicle. As of this year, fewer than 20 people have descended to the bottom of the deepest trench and come back. By contrast, over 600 people have been to space, with a commercial program now routinely taking passengers on brief orbital flights. We have made low Earth orbit into a tourist destination, and we still haven't properly mapped our own ocean floor. The reason is not a lack of interest. It is the physics. Water does not cooperate with electromagnetic signals the way air does. Radio waves cannot penetrate more than a few meters of seawater, which means that GPS, satellite imaging, all the tools we use to map the surface of the planet from above, are useless below the surface of the ocean. To map the seafloor, you have to physically go above it, either with a crewed or uncrewed vehicle, or with a surface ship dragging sonar down through the water column. The technique used by the ship we started with tonight is called multi-beam sonar. A ship moves slowly across the ocean surface, emitting a fan of sound pulses aimed downward at angles that spread out from directly beneath the hull. The pulses travel down through the water at roughly 1,500 meters per second. The speed of sound in seawater varies slightly with temperature and salinity, and those variations are corrected for in the calculation. Hit the sea floor and bounce back up to sensors along the ship's hull. From the time each pulse takes to return and the precise angle at which it arrives, a computer builds a three-dimensional model of the terrain below. The width of the mapped swath is roughly 4 times the water depth, so in water, 4,000 meters deep, the ship maps a strip about 16 kilometers wide. Which sounds useful, until you consider that the ocean covers 361 million square kilometers, and the ship can only move at about 8 to 10 knots while the sonar is running. It is slow work, patient work, and the ocean is very large. The Seabed 2030 project, a collaboration between the Nippon Foundation and the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, known as GEBCO, set itself the target of mapping the entire ocean floor to modern standards by the end of this decade. When the project published its first benchmark figures in 2017, the results stopped people in the field. 6%. 6% of the ocean floor had been surveyed to a resolution where you could actually see features at roughly the scale of a football pitch. Not a geological feature, a building. When the benchmark was updated in 2022, the figure had reached 23.4%. By June 2025, the announcement came that 27.3% of the ocean floor had been mapped to modern standards. Most accounts of this stop there and call it progress. And it is. But here is the number nobody reads out loud. 72.7%. That is the proportion of the ocean floor that is still, as of right now, known only in the roughest satellite gravity approximation. A blur, not a map. 3/4 of the bottom of the world. The same 3/4 it has always been. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. We have mapped the surface of Venus through kilometers of sulfuric acid cloud, using radar from orbit, at a resolution sharper than we have mapped most of the ocean floor we live above. Mars has been photographed from orbit at resolutions of 25 centimeters per pixel, down to the pebbles on its surface in some locations. The deepest parts of our own ocean we still know only as a smear of approximate depth. The scale of what multi-beam sonar must cover is almost impossible to convey in ordinary numbers. The Pacific Ocean alone covers 165 million square kilometers, an area larger than all the world's land masses combined. If a ship mapping the Pacific at, say, 10 knots covered a swath of 16 kilometers per pass and ran 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it would take approximately 3,000 ship years to complete one full survey of the Pacific alone. 3,000 years of a single ship sailing non-stop. Which is why the Seabed 2030 project requires an international fleet and cooperation from every kind of vessel. Research ships, commercial vessels, naval ships, all contributing their sonar data as they cross the ocean in the normal course of their work. There is a category of mapping being done by commercial shipping that most passengers on cruise ships or freight passengers don't know about. When a container ship crosses the Pacific on its route between Shanghai and Los Angeles, if it is equipped with sonar and has agreed to contribute its data to the international mapping effort, it is, slowly, one thin line at a time, adding to the chart of the seafloor beneath it. The largest ships, crossing the largest ocean, dragging the pulse of sound down through the water and bringing it back up as information. Thousands of crossings a year, each one adding a little to the chart. And still 3/4 of the floor is blank. Part of the reason the mapping is so slow, beyond the sheer scale of the ocean, is that the deep sea is not a passive environment. Currents affect the sound propagation. The precise speed of sound in seawater varies with temperature, salinity, and pressure, and those variations change with depth and with geography, requiring constant correction in the data processing algorithms. Ships move, and their motion introduces errors that have to be compensated for. The seafloor itself changes. Volcanic activity, submarine landslides, sediment movement from turbidity currents. So surveys conducted years apart may show different conditions in the same location. The ocean is not a fixed thing waiting to be measured. It is a dynamic system, and measuring it accurately is as much about understanding the system as it is about running the equipment. But what the sonar does bring back, the 27% we have, is extraordinary. Mountains and canyons and plains and valleys. A world of landscape as complex and varied as the surface above the water, hidden from sunlight since the formation of the ocean basins, speaking in the language of pressure and cold and the slow chemistry of the deep. Hold this phrase when we come back to the text later tonight. Above the springs of the waters. That's where Leviathan lives, according to the book. Not in the water, not at the bottom, but above the place where the water comes from. It's stranger than it sounds. We'll come back to it when we've gone further down. The ocean floor, on the other hand, is not a flat plain. What we have mapped is a landscape of extraordinary violence. There are mountain ranges down there longer than any on the surface of the planet. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge runs for 16,000 kilometers. From the Arctic Ocean, southward through the middle of the Atlantic, all the way to the sub-Antarctic. A continuous ridge of rock, pushed up from the seafloor by the force of the two tectonic plates on either side of it, slowly pulling apart. New seafloor forming at the join, the planet adding material to itself from the inside out. At its crest, the ridge rises 3 kilometers above the surrounding abyssal plain. Along its spine, there is a rift valley, a downward gash at the very peak of the ridge, where the two plates separate and lava wells up to fill the gap. If it were above the water, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge would be the largest mountain range on Earth by a considerable margin. Mostly we've never seen it. There are volcanoes down there, active ones, erupting in the dark, adding new seafloor to the world at this moment. The East Pacific rise is spreading at about 15 centimeters per year, fast as geological processes go, and at its crest, lava moves through rifts in the rock and solidifies almost instantly in the near-freezing water, forming structures called pillow basalts, rounded, glassy, black cushions of rock that have been building up along the ridges for millions of years. Under the lights of a submersible, fresh pillow basalt looks wet and almost soft. It still holds heat from the interior of the planet. There are lakes at the bottom of the sea. We'll come to those later, much later, when you're deep enough. They need their own moment. And there are springs, real springs, on the ocean floor, where material from beneath the sea floor wells up into the water column, carrying heat, or chemistry, or salt, changing the water around them, creating environments that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. Discovered, the first ones, in 1977, 48 years ago. In a book written 2,000 years ago, the creature of the deep lives above those springs. And an angel will not explain what she is. Not because the answer is frightening, because the answer is hidden. In a text that opens every other door, that shows a human being the structure of the heavens, the prison of the fallen, the chambers of the dead. This is the one thing the guide will not describe. The one locked door. And it's at the bottom of the sea. Now let's go and find out why. So that's the room we're standing over tonight. Now let's open the chapter that claims to know what's in it. Because the passage is only a few lines long, and almost every line has something odd in it. The Book of Enoch is not a single document. That's the first thing most people don't know. And it matters, because when you understand what the book actually is, the locked door becomes stranger rather than less strange. What we call First Enoch is actually a collection of 5 separate texts, composed over several centuries by multiple authors, and eventually assembled into a single work by a tradition that believed they all belonged together because they were all connected to the same figure, Enoch, the 7th patriarch in the line from Adam to Noah, who according to the Book of Genesis walked with God and was taken, not killed, taken, into the presence of the divine. The tradition built an enormous literature around that taking. If Enoch was taken up, the reasoning went, then he saw things. If he saw things, he described them. And the texts that carry his name are the record of what he saw, the structure of the heavens, the paths of the sun and moon, the names and functions of the angels, the fate of the fallen watchers who came down from heaven and corrupted the earth, the chambers where the dead are kept until the judgment, the landscape of the final age. It is a literature of disclosure, revelation. The whole point is that the curtain is pulled back, that a human being, Enoch, is shown the machinery of the cosmos from the inside, so that the reader can understand what is actually happening in a world that looks, from the outside, like chaos. The 5 sections of First Enoch have different names: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. The one we're in tonight, chapter 60, sits within the Book of Parables, also called the Similitudes of Enoch. Scholars date the Similitudes to approximately the 1st century BCE, or the 1st century of the Common Era, which puts it roughly contemporary with the oldest Christian texts, and perhaps somewhat older. The Similitudes were not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a significant absence that has generated substantial debate, but fragments of the other 4 sections were found there, confirming that First Enoch circulated in Jewish communities of the Second Temple period as a recognized and respected body of scripture. Chapter 60 specifically sits within material that deals with Noah, a somewhat odd insertion into the Enoch text, because Noah is speaking in the first person, and the speaker seems to shift without explanation. Scholars have proposed various accounts of this, that the Noahic material was originally a separate source that was incorporated, that the author intended a transition but left it unmarked, that the confusion in the manuscript tradition reflects a genuinely complicated compositional history. None of this is resolved. The text is a puzzle even before you get to the monsters, but the monsters are where we're going. Let me read you the passage. The translation is by Robert Henry Charles, whose 1906 critical edition remains the standard English language reference for First Enoch. I've also checked it against the 2001 Hermania edition by George W. E. Nicholsburg, one of the foremost living scholars of the Enochic tradition. And on that day were 2 monsters parted, a female monster named Leviathan, to dwell in the abysses of the ocean over the fountains of the waters. But the male is named Behemoth, who occupied with his breast a waste wilderness named Duidine, on the east of the garden where the elect and righteous dwell, where my grandfather was taken up, the 7th from Adam, the first man whom the Lord of Spirits created. Pause there. And I besought the other angel that he should show me the might of those monsters, how they were parted on one day and cast, the one into the abysses of the sea, and the other unto the dry land of the wilderness. And he said to me, Thou son of man, herein thou dost seek to know what is hidden. That is the passage, 11 sentences, and almost every one of them is doing something unusual. Let's take the first thing. On that day were 2 monsters parted. The phrasing in the Ge'ez, the Ethiopic language in which the complete text of First Enoch survives, implies a specific day in the order of creation. This is not a battle. No god defeats the monsters and sends them away. No warrior casts them into the deep. They are simply divided, separated from each other, as the waters were separated from the dry land in Genesis 1, as the light was separated from the darkness. Separation, in this cosmological grammar, is a creative act. You don't destroy the chaos, you divide it. And then there's the name, Duodyne, a waste wilderness called Duodyne, on the east of the garden. Remember that name, remember that desert. There is a male half to this story, and he's in the east, in the dry land, and he matters in ways the text doesn't say directly. We'll come back to him when we've gone further east ourselves. Now here is the thing that most commentaries mention, but most documentary accounts skim past entirely. 1 Enoch chapter 60 is the earliest known text in any tradition: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Ugaritic, Akkadian, to do all of the following at once. Name Leviathan and Behemoth as a pair, assign them explicit sexes, female and male, give them separate and specific dwelling places, and frame their existence as the result of an act of primordial division. The Book of Job, written before this passage and containing the most famous descriptions of both creatures in the Hebrew Bible, does none of these things. In Job, chapters 40 and 41, God speaks from the whirlwind and describes two extraordinary animals, Behemoth in chapter 40, Leviathan in chapter 41. The speeches are remarkable literature. They are meant to overwhelm Job, to show him how vast and complex and beyond human the creation is, by pointing to two creatures whose power far exceeds anything human ability could manage. The crocodile or the hippopotamus. The debate about what exactly Behemoth and Leviathan are in Job has never been resolved, are presented as evidence of a creator whose work is incomprehensible. But in Job, they are separate. They appear in consecutive speeches as two examples of the same argument, not as a paired couple. Job gives them no sex. Job gives them no specific cosmological relationship to each other, no hint that they were once together and were divided. Job doesn't separate them. They are simply there, vast and beyond understanding, offered as evidence of God's power. The Book of Job, probably the oldest book in the Hebrew Bible in terms of its underlying material, though its current form is likely from the 6th or 5th century BCE, uses Leviathan as the climax of the divine speech from the whirlwind. The speech is about scale and power. Can you bind the Pleiades? Do you know where the light goes when the day ends? Can you command the morning? Each question is designed to overwhelm Job's assumption that the universe operates on terms he can evaluate. And then, at the peak of this overwhelming rhetoric, comes Leviathan. The description in Job 41 is one of the most remarkable passages in ancient literature. The creature breathes fire. Its breath sets coals ablaze. Its hide is so tough that no sword, no spear, no arrow, no javelin can penetrate it. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. And then, nothing on earth is its equal. A creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. The king over all that are proud. The creature that makes the mighty terrified. The thing that nothing on earth equals. And God says to Job, "Look at it. Look at what I made. Do you think you can evaluate what I am doing in the world when you cannot even begin to approach what I made?" The rhetorical function of Leviathan in Job is to be incomprehensible, to be the evidence of a maker whose work is beyond the scale of human understanding. And that function depends entirely on Leviathan remaining uncontained. If the creature were already addressed and kept, already separated, already assigned, it would lose its rhetorical power. A monster in a cage is not the same as a monster at large. Job's Leviathan has to be free, in principle, for its freedom to be terrifying. 1 Enoch does something that seems, on first reading, to diminish the monster. If Leviathan is contained, kept in the deep, assigned an address, maintained in her separation from Behemoth, isn't she less frightening? Isn't the cage the whole point? But the tradition understood something that takes a moment to see. The containment is not a diminishment, It is a different kind of terrifying. The monster in the sea, kept for the whole of history, maintained in her address, kept apart from Behemoth by the order of the world, that monster is not safe because she is contained. She is terrible because the containment is the only thing standing between the ordered world and what comes when the separation fails. The founding act of creation was dividing the chaos. The ordered world is what the division produces. The chaos is still there, still present, still as enormous as it ever was. She was not weakened, she was separated. And the difference between the world continuing and the world being unmade is that separation holding. The locked door is not a smaller version of the monster. The locked door is everything. First, Enoch does something new. It pairs them. It sexes them. It separates them. It gives the separation a date, that day, the day of creation, and assigns them specific addresses. And it raises, with Enoch's question and the angel's refusal, the explicit possibility that there is something about this pairing, this sexing, this separation, that is not for human minds to follow. Everything that comes after, everything the rabbis built on this, everything Christian mysticism did with Leviathan as chaos and Behemoth as land monster, everything the medieval tradition pictured when it drew the beasts of the end times, it flows from this passage. This chapter is the source, the chapter where the text first says, "These two go together, and they are kept apart, and the keeping is the order of the world." One of them is female. No text before this one gives Leviathan a sex. No text before this one gives Behemoth a sex. And the pairing, female sea, male desert, remains one of those details that scholars have discussed and never fully explained. Remember that. Why female? Why the sea? Why the male is in the dry wasteland to the east? When we go deeper tonight, that question opens something. Now, the refusal. Let's sit with it properly. Enoch has been walking through a disclosure, a guided tour of the hidden structure of reality, which is the whole point of the genre. The angel with him has answered every question, has shown him the chambers where the souls of the righteous and the wicked are kept, has walked him through the physical structure of the heavens, has explained the paths of the stars, the function of the lightning, the storehouses of wind and snow, has shown him the prison of the watchers, the fallen angels who came to earth and took human women and produced the monstrous Nephilim, whose violence is the cause of the flood. A guide has been comprehensively forthcoming. And then Enoch asks about the monsters. He asks to see their might. He asks how they were divided on that day. He wants to understand the mechanism of the separation, the founding act of the created world, the primal division that contains the chaos. And the guide says, "Thou son of man, herein thou dost seek to know what is hidden." Not, "I don't know," not, "You're not ready," not, "The question is misformed." The angel does not decline to answer because the answer is too terrifying. He declines because the answer is, by definition, hidden. This is one of the hidden things. It is in the category of what is not given to human minds. The refusal is the answer. The hiddenness is the content. What does a Revelation text do with a locked door? It names it. It points to it. It says, "Here is the one thing we cannot show you." And by naming it, it gives the locked door a kind of presence it wouldn't have if the tour had simply skipped past the room. Enoch asks. The angel refuses. And the refusal stays in the text. It's not removed by a later editor, not smoothed over, not replaced with a partial answer, because the tradition understood that the locked door was part of the point. And here is the thing about that door. We'll come back to it at the very end of the night. Back to the refusal, back to the locked room, back to the angel's exact words. Because by the time we get there, the refusal will make sense in a way that goes beyond the text. The deep hasn't opened for the book, and it hasn't opened for us either. Not yet. Feel the weight of the night around you. If there is water nearby, even rain on a window, even the distant sound of a river, let it be part of this. The text was written in a world that knew the sound of water, that built its cities beside rivers, that navigated by the stars above the sea, that understood the horizon as a limit and a promise at the same time. About a quarter of the ocean floor has been mapped to modern standards. In 2017, it was 6%. We have better maps of Mars. We are, right now, on a planet whose surface we mostly do not know. That number will sit under everything we say tonight. A door that doesn't open. So we do the only thing left. We go and ask the neighbors. Because Enoch did not invent this. And the older versions are stranger. Before there was light, before there was land, before there was a sun in the sky, or any creature to look up at it, there was water. That is not a poetic opening. It is the structure of reality as the ancient Near Eastern world understood it. Across the cultures of the Fertile Crescent, across the river valleys and coastal plains and desert borderlands where the earliest writing began, the fundamental picture of the cosmos was the same. Before creation, there was water, not an ocean in the sense we mean, a bounded body of liquid resting on the surface of a planet, something older than that, something that existed before the world was divided into its parts, a primal substance, at once material and dangerous, from which everything else was drawn by an act of violent or careful separation. This water had a name. In Akkadian, the language of ancient Babylon, it was called the Tiamtu, the sea, the deep. In Hebrew it became the Tehom. In Greek, the Abyssos, the abyss. These words share a root. The ancient Near Eastern idea of the primordial deep moved from language to language because the people who used those languages shared a cosmological heritage that was, at its foundation, the same idea. The world was built on top of, and out of, a darkness beneath the water. Now listen to how Genesis opens. Not the first line, you know the first line. Listen to the second verse. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The deep is already there, before the command, "Let there be light," before light is divided from darkness, before sky is divided from earth, before the dry land is gathered from the sea, before any of the separation acts that constitute the creation story, the Tehom is present. It is not created in the text. It is the background against which creation happens. The raw material of Genesis 1 is not nothing. It is dark water. Most readings of this passage move past it quickly, focused on the drama of the commands and the formations. But the theologians and historians of religion who have sat with this opening for centuries notice that it is theologically loaded. The deep in Genesis is not an afterthought. It is the condition. And creation, in this account, is not making something from nothing. It is imposing order on a prior chaos, a dark, formless, watery chaos that already existed when the story begins, that is subdued by the acts of separation that follow, and that continues to exist underneath and around the ordered world, held in place by the same acts of separation that made the world habitable. The water is contained. It is not destroyed. Here is the detail that most accounts of the Genesis flood skip over. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The fountains of the great deep burst open, not rain began to fall. The flood in Genesis does not begin with rain. It begins with the deep coming up. The primal water, contained since the beginning of creation, breaks its containment, and the world is, for a time, returned to what it was before the separation. Formless, watery, covered. The ordered world briefly undone, the chaos reinstated, the separation reversed. The rain came second. The first rupture was from below. This matters because it reframes what the flood is doing in the text. It is not simply a catastrophic storm. It is a brief unmaking of creation, the primal deep returning to the surface, the world temporarily become what it was before the separation acts of Genesis 1 gave it shape. Noah floating on the water is Noah floating on the Tehom itself. The chaos water briefly returned to its pre-creative state, with a single family preserved to begin the reordering that follows. And what does this have to do with the monsters? If 1st Enoch chapter 60 is read within this cosmological frame, and it almost certainly should be, because the author of the similitudes was steeped in the same tradition, then the separation of Leviathan and Behemoth on that day is the same kind of act as the separations in Genesis 1. Not the creation of new things, but the division of pre-existing chaos. On the day the world was ordered, the chaos water was given 2 bodies, one female, one male, and they were divided and sent to their places, the deep and the desert, the sea and the wasteland, the wet and the dry. And the order of the world depends on that division holding. This interpretation, reading Leviathan and Behemoth as embodied representations of the primordial chaos, contained rather than destroyed, the order of the world depending on their separation, is the mainstream scholarly reading of the passage. Nicholsburg reads it this way. John J. Collins, whose introduction to the apocalyptic literature is the standard reference in the field, reads it this way. Michael Gnibb, who produced the critical Ethiopic edition of 1st Enoch, reads it this way. This is not a fringe or mystical interpretation. It is what careful textual scholarship, taking the document seriously on its own terms, concludes. The distinction between containing chaos and destroying chaos is one of the most important differences between the various ancient cosmological traditions, and it's worth sitting with it for a moment because it carries a weight that goes beyond the textual. Most modern people, if they imagine a creation story, imagine something like, the world was created from nothing. God spoke, or the universe expanded, or the first cause caused the first effect, and before that there was nothing, and after that there was the world. The nothing to something model of creation. This is partly a Greek philosophical inheritance, the idea of creation ex nihilo, from nothing. But it's also a common intuition. The world came from somewhere. Before it there was not world. But the ancient Near Eastern world, the world that produced the Bible, that produced 1st Enoch, that produced the Ugaritic texts and the Enuma Elish, had a very different intuition. The world came not from nothing but from something, from the primal water, the chaos sea, the Tehom. And the primal water was not destroyed in the process. It was addressed, contained, given boundaries. The sky is what keeps the upper water out. The dry land is what the lower water is held away from. The order of the world is a set of maintained separations, and what maintains them is the ongoing creative act of a cosmos that keeps itself in shape by holding its own chaos at arm's length. This is a more honest model of reality, in certain ways, than the ex nihilo account. Things are not created from nothing. Order is produced by the management of disorder. Systems maintain themselves by containing what would otherwise overwhelm them. The human body does this continuously. The immune system, the nervous system, the processes of cellular repair and regulation, maintaining order against the entropy that would otherwise dissolve it. Cities do this. Ecosystems do this. The ocean does this, in its own way, managing the chemistry and temperature of its water through systems of circulation so complex and vast that we are still learning their structure. The ancient cosmology was not scientifically accurate, but it was structurally observant. The world doesn't come from nothing. The world comes from managed chaos. And the management is ongoing, which is why the monsters are never destroyed, only kept. Enoch's tradition inherited that structural insight and gave it the most concrete possible form: 2 bodies, 2 addresses, 1 separation. And an angel who will not explain the arrangement, because the arrangement is the thing that allows the explanation to happen at all. You can't describe the foundation of knowledge from inside the structure it supports. The locked door is not ignorance. It is integrity. The integrity of a system that doesn't describe its own bottom. The interpretation that treats the passage as a literal cosmological claim about actual physical beings inhabiting the physical ocean floor is held by some communities of faith, and those communities engage with the text seriously and thoughtfully. But the passage itself does not require that reading. It is most coherent when understood as what it probably is: a systematization of an inherited cosmological idea, giving bodies and addresses to the chaos that the tradition always knew was down there. And here is where the reading becomes interesting beyond the text itself. If the order of the world depends on the contained chaos not being disturbed, if what holds everything together is a primordial act of separation that is maintained rather than resolved, then the locked door makes sense. Not because the answer to what's in the deep is terrible, but because the question of what's in the deep is exactly the question you are not supposed to answer. The hiddenness is structural. The locked room is a feature, not a bug. The mystery of the deep is not a failure of knowledge. It is the necessary condition of the ordered world. You cannot know what is in the deep, because what is in the deep is the thing that existence is built to contain, and 3/4 of the ocean floor is still unmapped. That is, at some level, the rhyme between an ancient text and a modern fact that no one planned. We have built our world above the deep. We have built science, ships, civilization, all of it above a floor we mostly haven't seen. And the floor holds, and the chaos, whatever it is, stays down. There is one more thing to tell you about what finally happens to these 2 creatures. I'll tell you near the end of the night, when we're almost back at the surface. But remember that the ending is not what you'd expect. It is not a battle. Everything in the tradition points toward a battle. The storm god, the monster, the victory, the world made safe. But that's not the ending the text gives them. Hold that. What happens to them at the end of everything is something much stranger and much more human. And once you start looking for that water, that divided, dangerous, contained first water, you find it everywhere, under 4 different civilizations, in 4 different languages, written by people who never read each other, doing exactly the same job. Let's go find it. In 1929, a Syrian farmer was ploughing a field near the village of Ras Shamra, on the northern coast of what was then the French Mandate of Syria, about 12 kilometers north of the modern city of Latakia. His plough struck something. He dug. What he found was a stone-lined tomb. Archaeologists arrived that same year, Claude Schaeffer and Georges Chenet, from the French Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres, and what they began uncovering over the following decades was not a tomb, but an entire city, Ugarit, a Bronze Age port that had been continuously occupied from approximately 6000 BCE until its sudden, catastrophic destruction sometime around 1185 BCE, destroyed so completely, so finally, that it was never rebuilt, never resettled, its name preserved only in the cuneiform records of the neighbouring powers who traded with it, until the moment the plough struck the edge of its buried library. The tablets from Ras Shamra changed the study of the ancient world in ways that are still being absorbed. They were written in an early alphabetic cuneiform script, one of the oldest true alphabets in human history, predating most of the scripts we think of as ancient, in a language now called Ugaritic, a northwest Semitic language so closely related to ancient Hebrew that when scholars first began translating the religious and mythological texts, they experienced a sustained shock of recognition. The vocabulary was familiar, the grammar was familiar, The themes, the characters, the conflicts, all of it rhymed, with an exactness too precise to be coincidence, with the Hebrew Bible. Among the mythological texts is a cycle of stories centered on Baal, the god of storm, rain, and fertility, and his conflicts with rival powers for the lordship of the cosmos. He fights Yam, the god of the sea and rivers, who represents the primordial chaotic water. He descends to the underworld. He defeats enemies. And in the account of one of those victories, a name appears that stopped scholars cold. In tablets from Ras Shamra, written before the Hebrew Bible was compiled in its current form, a seven-headed sea dragon called Lotan is described as defeated by the storm god. The relevant passage, in translation, reads something like, "When you smote Lotan, the fleeing serpent, when you finished off the twisting serpent, the mighty one with seven heads." Compare this with Isaiah 27:1 from the Hebrew Bible. "In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea." The vocabulary is almost identical, and the names are the same word. Lotan and Leviathan share the same root, the consonants lamed tet nun, in the same language family. They are the same creature. The Bible's sea monster has a family tree, and its roots are in the tablets of a Bronze Age port city on the Syrian coast. Most documentaries that mention this stop at the linguistic connection. The names are the same, interesting, moving on. But the connection goes deeper than a shared name. It goes to the structure of what the monster is doing in both texts. At Ugarit, Lotan is defeated. Baal kills him, or her, in combat, and the killing is part of the storm god's demonstration of supremacy. The ordered world is made safe by the destruction of the chaos creature. It is a battle myth, and the battle has a winner. In the Hebrew Bible, Leviathan is not dead. The creatures in Isaiah 27 are targets of a future act. In that day, the Lord will punish, which means they're still present, still existing, still somewhere out there. In Job, the question, "Can you pull Leviathan in with a fish hook?" implies that Leviathan is there, in the water, alive, too powerful to be pulled in, but present, not destroyed, contained. And in 1 Enoch, the destruction has been removed entirely. Leviathan is not killed. She is separated, addressed, kept in the deep above the springs of the water. Behemoth is not killed either. He is kept in the desert. The chaos is maintained, not resolved. The tradition moved, over several centuries, from killing the monster to containing it. From the Ugaritic storm god battle, where Lotan dies, to the Enochic cosmology, where Leviathan and Behemoth are held. The ancient world, across the language families, across the generations, gradually replaced the idea of destroying chaos with the idea of managing it, keeping it, giving it an address, and maintaining the separation. Something in that tradition understood what we now call a fundamental truth of complex systems. You can't destroy entropy. You can only manage it. There's a detail in the Baal cycle from Ugarit that most translations, the ones available online, the ones in popular summaries, don't render with enough precision to notice. When Lotan is described as the fleeing serpent and the coiling serpent, these are not casual adjectives. They correspond directly to the adjectives used for Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1, the gliding serpent, and the coiling serpent. The Hebrew words are bariach, fleeing or fleeing quickly, and akalaton, twisting or coiling. And the Ugaritic words used for Lotan are functionally identical in meaning and grammatical form. This is not a loose thematic parallel. It is near verbatim shared vocabulary across two languages, two texts, and several centuries. The Isaiah passage was, almost certainly, pulling from the same traditional description that the Baal cycle uses. A stock description of the sea monster, a set of epithets that had been attached to the creature for so long that they traveled with it as it moved from Ugaritic tradition into Hebrew tradition, from coastal Syria into the inland highlands, from a polytheistic context into a strictly monotheistic one. The creature was Lotan first, then Leviathan. The name changed and the theology around it changed enormously, a polarity shift from polytheism to monotheism, from a battle between equals to a contest between creator and creation. But the monster survived the transition. It crossed the border, it changed language, it retained its epithets. And in First Enoch, it changed sex, gained a companion, and received a permanent address. The sea monster is one of the most durable ideas in human cultural history. Attested now from the 2nd millennium BCE at Ugarit, preserved through the Hebrew tradition, developed in the Enochic tradition of the Second Temple period, taken into the Christian tradition through the Book of Revelation's beast from the sea, and still alive in the medieval sea charts with their warnings at the edge of the known world. Nearly 4,000 years. The same creature, wearing different names, keeping its job at the boundary of what human beings know and what they don't. What persists, across all those versions, is the function. The sea monster is always at the edge, always at the limit of the map, always in the place where the known world gives way to what is beyond it. That function, guardian or prisoner of the outer boundary, is what the tradition needed from the creature, and what the tradition kept, regardless of what name it travelled under. The ocean required a creature, the boundary required a keeper, the edge of the map required something to mark it, and every culture that stood at the water's edge and looked out put something there, in the beyond, doing the same job. The air in an archive has a particular quality, cool and still, a little dry. If you've ever been in a museum storeroom, the ones they don't usually let you into, with the trays of sherds and the shelves of tablets, you know the particular silence of very old things. It's the silence the tablets from Ras Shamra have been sitting in since 1929, in the storerooms of the National Museum of Damascus and the Louvre, in cabinets with better climate control than most people's living rooms. A 7-headed dragon's name, on a clay tablet, waiting almost a century to be read alongside the text it rhymes with. But Lotan is male, or at least not explicitly female, in the Ugaritic texts. And that means Ugarit alone doesn't answer the question of where the female sea monster comes from. For that, we need to go further east, to the river country, to the beginning, Mesopotamia, and the twin Duodyne, the desert, east of the garden. Let's go there now. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, when on high, is one of the oldest substantial narrative texts in human history. Preserved on 7 clay tablets, it was recited at the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, as a ceremonial reenactment of the creation of the world. Its core narrative was probably composed around the 12th century BCE, though it almost certainly contains material that is older. How much older is debated, but elements of the cosmology appear in texts from the early 2nd millennium, which would put the underlying ideas more than 4,000 years from where we stand now. It begins as everything in the ancient Near East begins, with water. When the skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together, but had not formed pastures nor discovered reed beds. Tiamat is the salt water. Specifically, she is the primal ocean, the chaos water that existed before the world was separated into its parts. And she is explicitly, from the first line, female. The great watery chaos of Babylon is a she. She is the primordial mother, who bore them all, generative, vast, and in the end, destroyed. The world is made when the god Marduk kills Tiamat and divides her body. From her upper half he makes the sky. From her lower half he makes the earth. The ordered world, the world you can live in, farm in, build cities in, is made from the split-open body of the primordial Sea Mother. The separation of sky from earth is the separation of Tiamat from herself. And the waters that don't become the sky, the fresh water, the underground water, become the domain of Ea, the god of wisdom and magic, who lives in the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Not the salt ocean above, the sweet water below, the water that surfaces as springs, wells, rivers, the water that comes up through the ground. Now bring Behemoth back, male, desert, east, the wilderness on the far side of the garden. The Apsu, the underground freshwater sea, is the complement to Tiamat's salt ocean. One above, one below. One female, one male. One the chaotic salt water of the open ocean. One the controlled deep of the underground sweet water. The world sits between them, squeezed, as it were, between two primordial waters, one above, contained as the sky, and one below, accessible as springs. The parallel with Leviathan in the sea and Behemoth in the desert is structural. The female in the wet, deep, oceanic world. The male in the dry, earthly desert world. The two extremes of the cosmos, the place of too much water and the place of no water, each given a monstrous inhabitant, each kept at maximum distance from the other. The Mesopotamian tradition also gives us the concept of the Abzu, the freshwater abyss, as a place of wisdom. Enki, the Sumerian name for the god who later becomes Akkadian Ea, lives in the Abzu, the underground sweet-water sea. And Enki is not only the god of the deep, he is the god of wisdom, of craft, of magic, of the practical arts. The deep, in the Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, is not only a place of chaos, it is also a place of knowledge. This is a profound complication of the locked door tradition. The Babylonian deep is simultaneously the chaos, Tiamat, and the wisdom, Enki in the Apsu. The danger and the knowledge coexist in the same cosmological space, separated by the kind of distinction that only a practiced cosmology can maintain. The saltwater chaos is dangerous and was divided. The sweetwater depth is dangerous too, but is also where the wisdom lives, and they are held in careful relationship by the divine order. In 1st Enoch, the deep is purely the place of what is hidden, the locked door, the thing the angel won't describe. But the earlier tradition's association of the deep with knowledge is not entirely absent. It surfaces, obliquely, in the character of the refusal. Thou dost seek to know what is hidden. The hidden thing and the known thing are connected. The angel's refusal acknowledges that knowledge is being sought, that the question itself is appropriate, even if the answer is withheld. The deep is where knowledge lives, in the Mesopotamian tradition. The deep is where knowledge ends, in the Enochic tradition. These are not as different as they seem. In both cases, the boundary between what is known and what is not, between the ordered world and the chaos it rests on, is the deep. Knowledge is adjacent to that boundary, touching it from the inside. Beyond the boundary, beyond what knowledge can reach, the chaos continues, doing whatever contained chaos does. And tonight, on our own planet, that boundary is sitting at the edge of a sonar chart, at the line between the 27% we've mapped and the 73% we haven't. On one side of the line, names and depth measurements and photographs and biological specimens and gravity readings. On the other, the pulse going down and nothing yet coming back, or not enough coming back to be sure of, the blank space the chart reserves for what it doesn't know. The Babylonian god of wisdom lives in the deep. We have sent our instruments into the deep and found something that functions, in a cosmological grammar, as exactly that. Not a god, but a kind of knowledge we didn't know existed. in the vents and the seeps and the brine pools, and we are still learning what it is. Was this a direct borrowing? Did the author of 1st Enoch chapter 60 read the Enuma Elish? The scholarly consensus is that direct literary dependence is unlikely. The texts are quite different in character, and the specific details of the Enochic passage don't obviously map onto the Babylonian. What's more likely is that both texts draw from a shared cosmological framework that circulated across the ancient Near East through trade, through the movement of scribes, through the diplomatic correspondence that connected the great powers of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. Ideas travel. The idea of the primordial chaos water, divided at creation, given form and kept, was an idea whose time had come, multiple times, in multiple languages, because it solved the same problem for everyone. How do you account for the continued existence of disorder in an ordered world? You contain it, you divide it, you give it an address. If you're still with me right now, or half with me, drifting, which is exactly the right way to be, I want to ask you something before we go further. What is the deepest water you've ever been in? Not measured in meters, felt, in your body, in the way the water was around you. An ocean, a lake, a dark river, the moment you couldn't see the bottom. Tell me in the comments when you wake up. I read them in the mornings, and I think about the geographies you're each carrying around. The Babylonian tradition gives us Tiamat, the female sea, the saltwater chaos, divided at the beginning, and the Apsu, the male deep, the underground fresh water. And it tells us they were once mixed together, inseparable, and were parted. The world began with their separation, and the world continues by their remaining separated. 1st Enoch takes that structure, female sea, male wilderness, the two kept apart, the world between them, and makes it explicit, personal, urgent, and it names the refusal. It doesn't just have a locked door, it points to the locked door and says, "Here, this is where permitted knowledge ends. This is the thing even the angel won't explain." And then the Noahic material moves on, and the text resumes its disclosure, and the locked door remains locked, and the deep remains unmapped. The springs, above the springs of the waters. You've been holding that phrase for an hour now, and it's time to pay it off. The Babylonian cosmology believed in a freshwater ocean beneath the world, the Apsu, connected to the surface ocean through springs, through the places where underground water came up through rock and soil and appeared at the surface as wells, as rivers, as the oases in the desert that were the difference between life and death for a traveler. The springs were not just convenient water sources, they were the places where the below became the above, where the underground world reached up into the ordinary world. Genesis 7 says the fountains of the great deep burst open when the flood came. The underground ocean, the Apsu, the Tehom, the great deep, came up through its springs. The flood was not rain overflowing the surface, it was the deep breaking containment, coming up through the fountains, through the springs, through the passages that in ordinary times brought water gently upward from below. In 1st Enoch, Leviathan lives above the springs of the waters, not in the ocean, above the springs, above the places where the deep comes up into the world, the permeable boundary between the water above and the water below. She is placed at the junction point, the guardian or the prisoner of the place where the worlds connect. Now here is the piece of this that startled me when I first encountered it. And it's something that would have been completely unknown to the author of 1st Enoch, something discovered only in the 1970s and 1980s. There are springs at the bottom of the sea, real ones, physical springs, on the ocean floor, where material from beneath the sea floor wells up into the water column above. Two kinds mainly. Hydrothermal vents, the first discovered in 1977 on the Galapagos Rift, in water 2,500 meters deep. are places where seawater has percolated down through cracks in the oceanic crust, been superheated by the magma below, and is forced back up again through chimneys of mineral deposits that can reach several meters in height. The fluid that emerges is not ordinary water. It's superheated, sometimes over 400 degrees Celsius, kept liquid only by the enormous pressure, and loaded with dissolved minerals, iron, copper, zinc, sulfur compounds, hydrogen sulfide. When it meets the cold seawater above it, the minerals precipitate out instantly, forming the dark cloud that gave these structures their common name, black smokers. Around the vents, no sunlight has ever arrived. And yet there is life. Dense, thriving, elaborate life. Tube worms the size of a person's forearm, white crabs, pink fish, fields of clams and mussels carpeting the rock. An entire ecosystem fed by chemical energy from the Earth's interior rather than solar energy from above. The discovery of hydrothermal vent ecosystems permanently altered biology by demonstrating that life doesn't need the sun. It can exist wherever there is energy and the right chemistry, which means it could exist, in principle, in the oceans of Europa or Enceladus, the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn that harbor liquid water beneath their frozen surfaces. The vents are springs, hot, mineral-laden, chemically transformed springs, but springs in the most fundamental sense, the place where what is below comes up into what is above. The hydrothermal vent discovery in 1977 was made by a team that was, technically, looking for something else. The Galapagos Rift expedition was using a towed camera system to survey the seafloor along a spreading center, the line where the ocean floor pulls apart and new seafloor is formed. They were looking for evidence of hydrothermal circulation as a geological process, not for biology. The biology was supposed to be absent, or nearly so, because there was no sunlight and the seafloor at 2,500 meters was expected to be cold, dark, and sparse. When the camera system passed over the vent field, the photographs that came back showed, in the words of one of the scientists on the expedition, wall-to-wall animals. Tube worms in dense clusters, clams the size of dinner plates, white crabs, mats of material on the seafloor that turned out to be communities of sulfur-oxidizing bacteria, the invisible engineers of the entire ecosystem. The biologists on the ship, who hadn't been part of planning the geology cruise, they had been invited along somewhat as an afterthought, on the grounds that one ought to have a biologist when exploring the ocean floor, were beside themselves. The following year, a follow-up expedition reached the same vent field with the submersible Alvin and collected the first specimens. The tube worms had no gut, none at all, no digestive system, and were later found to harbor sulfur-oxidizing bacteria inside their tissue, living in symbiosis with the worm, feeding on the worm's blood supply of dissolved sulfide, producing organic compounds in return. The worm was a living vessel for the bacteria. The bacteria were the worm's stomach, an entire new category of symbiosis, unknown to biology until that moment. The clams had blood the color of red wine. Their blood contained hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in human blood, but modified, in a way unique in biology, to simultaneously carry both oxygen and hydrogen sulfide without the sulfide poisoning the oxygen-carrying capacity of the protein. The clams had evolved their own specialized version of the molecule that carries oxygen in our blood, specifically adapted to carry both oxygen and the toxic gas that permeates the vent environment. A molecular solution to a molecular problem that no biologist had ever had occasion to think about, because the problem didn't exist in any environment previously known to biology. Since 1977, over 700 hydrothermal vent fields have been identified across the ocean floor. Most of them remain unvisited and unmapped beyond the coarsest characterization. Each one we do visit closely turns out to harbor species unknown to science, On average, approximately a quarter of the species found at any given vent field are new to science. The deep has been giving us new forms of life every time we go there, and we have been there almost nowhere. Whatever Leviathan is, she shares her address with tube worms that have no stomach, clams with modified hemoglobin, bacteria that eat poison, and crabs that live in the dark above springs of superheated mineral-laden water. If the ancient world had known this, I think they would have felt confirmed rather than surprised. The deep is, in fact, a place of extraordinary and alien life. The claim that something vast and strange lives there, above the springs of the waters, is not wrong. It's just that the strangeness, when you actually go there, exceeds anything a text could predict. And then there are cold seeps, the quieter cousins of the vents. Cold seeps are places where methane and hydrogen sulfide, produced by microbial and geological processes deep within the sediment beneath the seafloor, slowly percolate upward through the seafloor into the water column. They don't produce the dramatic chimneys of black smokers. They produce, instead, communities of organisms that metabolize the seeping chemicals, chemosynthetic bacteria as the base of the food web, and layered above them, a diverse community of clams, mussels, tube worms, and other creatures specifically adapted to the chemistry of the seep. The cold seeps are springs of a different kind, slower, gentler, colder, but springs nonetheless. The ancient world placed a sea monster above the springs. The springs are there. Not the monster, I want to be precise about this. The text is a text from the 1st century BCE, written by human beings working within an inherited cosmological tradition, doing their best to systematize and explain a world they were inside of. The ancient world was not oceanography. What I'm pointing to is something different, that the text, read in the light of what we now know is actually at the bottom of the sea, lands with an uncanny accuracy in a way no one planned and no one could have planned. She dwells above the springs. The springs are real, and the things that live around them are stranger than any monster. But the strangest thing at the bottom of the sea is still ahead of us. It's something the text almost names without knowing it, something that has a shoreline and waves, and its own preserved dead at its edges. We'll come to it when we go all the way down. Rome, Greece, the North. The Greek cosmological tradition gives us Oceanus, not the ocean as we use the word, but a god, a being, a boundary. In the oldest Greek sources, in Hesiod's Theogony, in Homer, Oceanus is a great river that encircles the world, forming its outer rim. It is the edge of the map, beyond it is the unknown, which is also the realm of the dead. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus sails to the edge of the world, to the stream of Oceanus, in order to communicate with the dead. The shore of the river of the outer sea is where the shades of the departed gather, and it is there, by pouring offerings into a trench and letting the blood of a black ram flow, that the dead can be summoned temporarily back to speech. The outer ocean is the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond it. To reach the dead, you go to the edge of the water. Medieval Greek cosmology retained this idea in modified form, and it passed into the Roman tradition, and from there into the worldview of the medieval European cartographers, who produced the maps we still find beautiful: the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the Salter map, the Ebstorf map. These maps ring the known world, the inhabited lands of Europe, Asia and Africa, with the surrounding ocean, and place in that ocean, at the edges of the map, the creatures of the deep. Not as decoration, as cosmological statement. Here is where the known world ends. Here is where something else begins. And what begins there is enormous and beyond the management of ordinary human beings. The phrase "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons, appears on the Lennox globe of 1503-07, one of the earliest globes made after the return of Columbus, marking the seas off the east coast of Asia. It is often cited as evidence that medieval people filled the unknown ocean with monsters out of simple ignorance. But that reading misses what the phrase is doing. It is not a confession of ignorance. It is a cosmological marker. This is the outer limit. This is where the category changes. The dragons aren't there because people were afraid of the dark. They're there because every cosmological tradition the medieval world inherited said that the outer deep is where the contained things live. You might be drifting by now. That's right. Let the images come and go without holding any of them too tightly. The maps, the sea edges, the creatures in the margins. Let them move through. You don't need to arrive anywhere. Just let the water carry you. There is a tradition in Chinese cosmology, the Shanhai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, a text assembled over centuries and reaching its current form roughly during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE to 200 CE, that describes a creature called Kunpeng. The Kunpeng is a bird so large that when it rises from the Northern Ocean, its wings blot out the sky for miles. But before it is a bird, it is a fish called a kun, so vast that no one can see from one end of it to the other. The fish, at certain moments, transforms into the bird and flies south. The ocean contains it when it is water creature. The sky contains it when it is air creature. The transformation is the movement between the two states of the world, the deep and the above. The Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosophical text compiled around the 4th century BCE, roughly contemporary with the earliest Enochic material, opens with the story of the Kunpeng. It is a story about scale. The mushroom of a morning cannot understand the succession of day and night. The chrysalis cannot understand the succession of spring and autumn. The creatures of the small cannot understand the knowledge of the great. The Kunpeng moves from ocean to sky because it exists at a scale beyond the comprehension of ordinary creatures. The cicada laughs at it, and the cicada is wrong. The ocean, in the Zhuangzi, is the category of the incomprehensibly large, the dimension of scale that ordinary creatures cannot access. The creature that inhabits it is not a monster in the Western sense. It is a being whose existence demonstrates that reality contains a dimension beyond ordinary perception. The sea is the place of that dimension, and the creature is its evidence. The same structure, a different language, a different culture, separated from the Mediterranean tradition by thousands of miles and with no plausible direct connection. But the same intuition. The deep is where the large thing lives. The deep is the dimension of what exceeds ordinary measure. And to understand the deep, you would need to be at the scale of what lives there, which ordinary creatures are not. The angel who refuses Enoch is not protecting a terrible secret. It is pointing to the same thing the Zhuangzi points to, the limit of the scale at which the question is being asked. You cannot know what is in the deep, because knowing requires standing at the scale of the deep, and you are not that large. The ocean, it turns out, is the answer to a question that every civilization asked independently, without knowing the others were asking the same thing. What is there at the edge? What is the shape of what we can't see? What lives in the place where knowing stops? And every culture answered, something vast, something kept, something that would overwhelm the ordered world if it were not maintained in its address, something the guide will not show you. In the Norse tradition, the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, encircles the entire world and bites its own tail. Odin cast it into the ocean in the beginning because it was too large, too dangerous, too much for the world of gods and humans. It lies on the floor of the sea, its body long enough to wrap the world, its tail in its own mouth. Its grip on its tail is what holds the world together, the circle complete, the serpent contained. At Ragnarok, it releases its tail, rises from the deep, and the world ends. The sea creature that holds the world, the monster at the boundary. the thing that cannot be allowed to meet its complement across the ordered space, the thing whose containment is the condition of the world's survival. Every culture that built cities beside an ocean, or sailed on one, or stood at the edge of one and looked out at the horizon, put something behind it. And the something they put there was always the same, a creature of enormous scale, contained by a founding act of division, kept in the place where the map runs out. The ancient world looked at the ocean and saw a prison, not in the sinister sense, in the structural sense, a place where something too large for the ordered world had been put, carefully, by an act of primordial wisdom, so that the ordinary world could continue, so that the days could proceed, so that the order could hold. From a certain angle, looking at the sonar charts we've drawn so far, 27% of the floor, 3/4 still dark, they weren't entirely wrong about the structure of the situation. So the whole ancient world agrees there is something in the deep, and one book says it was put there on purpose. It's the middle of the night now. Let's go all the way down and start with what is actually, verifiably, down there. Because the real deep is stranger than any text. We're going all the way down now, slowly. Stay with the descent. Picture it as a drop through layers. Not a fall, nothing as fast as that. A slow sinking, the way a piece of paper sinks through water, drifting, rotating slightly, taking its time. At the surface, the world you know. Sunlight on the water. The surface is warm, and it moves. Waves driven by the wind, swells rolling in from storms 1,000 miles away. The surface of the ocean rarely still, even on the calmest days. This is the sunlit zone, the photic zone, where photosynthesis is possible, where the plants of the sea, the phytoplankton, harvest the sun's energy and form the base of every food chain in the ocean. This is where the fish you've eaten spent their lives. This is where the dolphins are. You know this zone. It is the world. Down from 200 meters, the light begins to fail. Not all at once. It dims and shifts. Red goes first, absorbed within the first few meters of water. Orange disappears next, then yellow, then green. Blue is the last wavelength to be absorbed, so the fading of light in the ocean is a slow blue-greening, a twilight that deepens without getting dramatically darker until you've passed the point where any light at all arrives. Divers at 50 meters describe a strange clarity. Everything blue-green and luminous. No shadows, no color, but not dark. At 100 meters, the blue deepens. At 200, the last light is leaving. You are at the edge of the twilight zone. In the twilight zone, between 200 and 1,000 meters, there are creatures who have made a life in the transition. Lanternfish, with their rows of bioluminescent light organs along their bellies, migrating up toward the surface at night to feed and descending by day into the safety of the dark. Siphonophores, colonial organisms, each a community of specialized individuals functioning as a single being, some of them reaching 40 meters in length, the longest animals on Earth, drifting through the twilight on near-invisible bodies. Dragonfish, with their hinged jaws and extendable stomachs, and the long, glowing barbels dangling from their chins, which they use as lures in the dark. The twilight zone is the most biodiverse volume of the ocean by number of species, and it is also one of the least studied, because the pressure at 500 meters is already 50 times what it is at the surface, and the technology to work there, repeatedly, at scale, at the resolution of a field biologist, is still being developed. Below 1,000 meters, the midnight zone, the bathypelagic. No light from above has ever reached here. None. Not a photon. The zone exists in a darkness so complete that the only light is bioluminescence, the cold light made by living chemistry, which is the deep sea's own invention, its answer to the darkness it created. Some estimates suggest that 80% of deep-sea creatures produce their own light. The ocean invented the light bulb long before we did. Here there are anglerfish, and the word anglerfish barely prepares you for what the creature actually is. A deep-sea female anglerfish carries a modified dorsal spine above her head, which has evolved into a flexible filament tipped with a bulb of bioluminescent tissue. The bulb glows. In the total dark, it looks like food. Prey approaches. The anglerfish eats. The male anglerfish, substantially smaller, finds the female by following pheromones in the dark water, bites into her side, and fuses with her. His mouth fuses to her skin. His circulatory system merges with hers. His eyes atrophy. Most of his organs wither. He becomes, over a period of weeks, a pair of sperm-producing gonads attached to her body, sustained by her blood. This is reproduction in the midnight zone. It is strange enough that when the fused pairs were first described in the 1920s, scientists assumed the parasitic attachment was a different species. Here there are giant squid, Architeuthis dux, which can reach 12 meters in length, with eyes the size of a human head, the largest eyes of any animal on Earth, evolved to detect the faint bioluminescence of predators in the total dark. We know they exist because we find them. We find their beaks indigestible inside the stomachs of sperm whales. We find the sucker scars on sperm whale skin, circular marks, each sucker ringed with tiny hooks that rasp into the whale's skin in the grip of the wrestling giant squid. We find their bodies washed ashore. We filmed a living Architeuthis in its natural habitat, a brief sequence, the squid descending into the dark after its encounter with the camera, for the first time in 2004, once in over a century of looking. The sperm whale's echolocation, the clicks, is worth a moment of attention. The clicks are produced by a specialized organ in the whale's head called the spermaceti organ, which is filled with a waxy oil that was once prized by the whaling industry and is the origin of the whale's name. The oil focuses and amplifies the sound, producing a directional beam of clicks that the whale sends forward into the water. The clicks bounce off objects ahead, the seafloor, fish, squid, and return to the whale's lower jaw, which conducts the returning sound to the whale's inner ear. The spermaceti organ can produce clicks at a peak pressure of 230 decibels. For reference, a jet engine at close range produces about 140 decibels. A rifle shot is about 140 decibels. A sperm whale's click close up in the water is 230 decibels, the loudest sound produced by any animal on Earth. It is also, according to some accounts, loud enough at close range to stun or disorient prey. The whale may not simply be detecting the squid with its sonar. It may be weaponizing the sound, clicking at the squid hard enough to impair its ability to flee. We have detected this. We have inferred it. We have never seen it happen, in the full interaction, in the total dark where it takes place, with both animals present and fighting. The sperm whale dives to depths of 2,000 meters and beyond, holding its breath for up to 90 minutes, navigating in total darkness by sound. The giant squid inhabits the same zone, in the same darkness, and we have filmed it alive exactly a handful of times. The battle between these two creatures, which happens continuously, at depth, all over the world's deep oceans, is one of the great ongoing events of the natural world, and we have almost never witnessed it. We know it happens. We know it from the evidence it leaves behind, the beaks in the stomachs, the scars on the skin. We know it from inference and anatomy, and the occasional dead specimen. But the actual encounter, the whale clicking its way toward the squid in the dark, the squid seeing, with those enormous eyes, the faint glow of the whale's bioluminescent bacteria, the moment of engagement, remains almost entirely outside human experience. The deep keeps its events private, even the ones we know are happening. There are other things we know are happening down there, because we have found the evidence. without having observed the process. Underwater avalanches, turbidity currents, that move at speeds of up to 90 kilometers per hour along the continental slopes, carrying enormous volumes of sediment from the shallow shelves into the deep basins. We know they happen because we find the deposits, the turbidite layers in the sediment record, the distinctive sediment structures left by high-velocity flow. We have detected them seismically. We have, on very rare occasions, caught the edge of them on a seafloor sensor. But the event itself, the wall of sediment moving at freeway speed in the total dark, is something we have never filmed, never witnessed, never been present for. It is too fast, too dark, too far from anywhere we can easily reach. The deep does things we know about but haven't seen. This is a category that doesn't exist for most of the surface world. On land, on the surface of the sea, in the sky, if something happens with enough regularity, eventually someone will see it. Someone will be there. The deep is different. The deep happens largely without witnesses, and what it produces, the turbidite layers, the vent communities, the brine pools, it produces regardless of whether anyone is watching. The angel said, "Thou dost seek to know what is hidden." The deep has been hidden all along, not deliberately, not as a cosmological decision, simply because of physics. The ocean is opaque to light, opaque to radio, accessible only through great effort and expense, and technical sophistication. The deep has been keeping its own business, in the dark, since long before any of the traditions we've talked about tonight thought to ask what was down there. The sperm whale and the giant squid are engaged in one of the great predator-prey relationships on Earth. They hunt each other in the dark, in the midnight zone, in complete silence except for the clicks of the whale's echolocation, the most powerful biological sonar system known to exist. We have almost never witnessed this encounter. We know it happens because of the evidence left on both bodies. A relationship between two of the largest predatory animals in the ocean, and we have barely seen it. But none of this is the strangest thing. The strangest thing is below the midnight zone, below 2,000 meters, in the abyssal zone, and it doesn't look like a creature. It looks like something that shouldn't be able to exist. And it has a shoreline. There are lakes at the bottom of the sea. Not metaphors, real lakes. Bodies of water with shorelines, with beaches, with waves, pooled in depressions on the seafloor, sitting at the bottom of the ocean, still and separate from the seawater around them, with their own surface, their own edges, their own preserved dead. These are brine pools, hypersaline bodies of water, so dense with dissolved salt that ordinary seawater, which is itself salty, cannot mix into them. The brine is 4 to 5 times saltier than the surrounding ocean. Its density is dramatically higher, and because of that density, when brine seeps up through the seafloor and pools in a depression, it stays there. The seawater above it sits on top of it without mixing, the way oil and water separate, the way two liquids of very different densities always separate. The brine collects at the bottom of whatever depression it can find, and there it stays, indefinitely, cold and still and dense. The first brine pools were discovered in the early 1980s in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Red Sea by remotely operated vehicles on expedition from NOAA and from oceanographic research vessels. When the camera feed from the ROV first showed what appeared to be a lake, a clear, glassy surface with defined edges, sitting on the seafloor under 600 to 800 meters of ocean, the researchers watching the feed took a moment to understand what they were seeing. It looked like a visual artifact, a glitch in the camera, a trick of the lights. Then the ROV dropped lower, and its hull touched the surface of the brine pool, and the vehicle floated. Not because it had become suddenly more buoyant than usual, it is always buoyant in seawater, but because the brine was so much denser than ordinary seawater that the ROV's hull rested on its surface the way a boat rests on a lake. It didn't sink in. a lake at the bottom of the sea. It has a shoreline, a defined edge where the brine meets the overlying seawater, a margin where the chemistry changes abruptly, where the dense liquid ends and the ordinary ocean resumes. It has waves, very slow, very gentle, driven by the slow currents of the abyssal zone, rolling across the brine surface in long, low swells. It has a beach, after a fashion, the sediment that accumulates at the brine margin, shaped by the slow movement of the interface. One of the brine pools in the Gulf of Mexico has been given a name by the researchers who study it. They call it the Jacuzzi of Despair. Not for warmth. The brine is cold, close to the ambient temperature of the deep water around it, for what it does to the animals that fall into it. The extreme salinity of the brine is instantly lethal to almost all deep-sea creatures. Animals that venture too close, crabs, shrimp, the occasional fish drawn in by the chemosynthetic community at the brine margin, tumble into the pool, are overwhelmed by the chemistry within seconds, and die. Their bodies sink to the brine surface, which is too dense for them to sink through, and they rest there, in the pool, at the margin, preserved. The salt desiccates and mummifies them. The cold keeps them intact. There are crabs at the edge of the Jacuzzi of Despair who have been sitting there for years, perfectly preserved, in a posture that looks almost like they fell asleep. But there are organisms that live in the brine itself, specialized communities of extremophile bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms that have evolved to thrive in salt concentrations that would kill everything else we know. They metabolize sulfur compounds or methane or other chemicals in the brine, in the complete absence of oxygen and sunlight, and they build communities that form the base of a food web adapted to the most hostile chemical environment on Earth. We have found them. We are still learning what they are. Now read the text again. A female monster named Leviathan, to dwell in the abysses of the ocean over the fountains of the waters. The brine pools are fed from below. The brine originates in ancient salt deposits far beneath the seafloor, evaporite formations from seas that evaporated millions or hundreds of millions of years ago, buried under the weight of geological time, until water percolating through the rock dissolves the ancient salt and carries it upward as brine. The brine rises through the seafloor, through the same process that brings hydrothermal fluid up through vents, the same general category of upwelling from below, and pools on the surface of the sediment. It comes from underneath. It is, in the oldest sense of the word, a spring, a source. The water wells up from below the seafloor, pools on the ocean floor, and sits there, still, under the kilometers of water above it. She dwells above the springs of the waters. The springs are real. They are there tonight. In the Gulf of Mexico, in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, brine pools sitting in the dark, with their shorelines and their waves, and their preserved dead at the edges, bodies of water inside the water, fed by springs from below the ocean floor, exactly in the category the text names as her dwelling place. I will not claim the author of First Enoch knew about brine pools. He could not have. They require a submersible and a camera system, and an oceanographic research program, and an institutional infrastructure that did not exist in the 1st century BCE. What I am saying is something different and stranger, that the structure of the text, when placed alongside the structure of what is actually down there, produces a resonance no one planned. The text describes a boundary space, a place above the springs, in the abysses, where something is kept, and the actual ocean floor has exactly that, boundary spaces above springs, in the abyss, where something exists that shouldn't exist and does. The female sea. Why female? We said we'd come back to this. The female sea, the male desert, the pairing that no earlier text had made. In the Babylonian tradition, the primordial sea was Tiamat, female, the salt water, the chaos from which the world was made by division. In multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions, the sea is associated with the feminine, not as stereotype, not as insult, but as a mapping of properties. The sea is generative. It produces the water the world drinks. It harbors life in its depths. It has tidal rhythms that ancient peoples noticed and coded in the grammar of their language. The desert is male, dry, fixed, bounded, severe. Neither is a comfortable place. Both are extreme. But they are extreme in opposite directions, which is exactly the point. The chaos must be kept at maximum remove from itself. The female goes into the deepest wet, the male goes into the deepest dry, and the world, habitable, ordered, between extremes, exists in the space between them. What remains impossible to fully explain, what Nicholsberg notes with careful scholarly restraint, is why this author made the move. Why assign sex to Leviathan at all, when no text before this one had done so? Why make Behemoth male in the same breath? The tradition doesn't tell us. The text doesn't tell us. The angel won't tell us. The locked door is still locked, and the female sea is still there, in the abyss, above the springs, in the cold and the pressure and the permanent dark. It's time to come back up, because there is one more line in that chapter, and it's the one nobody quotes, and it is not what you would expect from a story about monsters. We're rising now. The pressure eases. The dark begins to give way to something almost dark. You can breathe. Let's come back to solid ground, or as close to solid ground as the Book of Enoch gets. First, the human beings. Before we resolve the loops we've opened tonight, it's worth pausing on this. Someone wrote these words. A real person, in a real room, with a lamp or in whatever light was available, pressed or inscribed or dictated these sentences in Aramaic sometime in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era. A real community read them, valued them, copied them onto new material when the old wore out, translated them when the language changed, carried them into the diaspora when the land changed, debated them in academies and read them aloud in synagogues, and eventually, when the tradition that had produced them shifted and the texts fell out of mainstream use, a community of Ethiopian Jews and Ethiopian Christians continued to copy and preserve them. In the highlands of Ethiopia, in monasteries where the light came in through thick walls and the altitude kept the air cool, the Book of Enoch was never declared apocryphal, never set aside, never lost. It remained part of the canon, copied and read and prayed through centuries, during which the rest of the world forgot it existed. In the 18th century, 1773 specifically, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce arrived in Ethiopia. He was there primarily to find the source of the Blue Nile, which he did, but he was also interested in manuscripts, and he came back with 3 Ethiopic manuscripts of First Enoch, which he carried to Europe and deposited in various libraries. The text rejoined the scholarly conversation. In 1800, Silvestre de Sarsi published a translation of excerpts. In 1821, Richard Lawrence produced the first complete English translation. In 1906, R.H. Charles published the critical edition, and from that point forward, the Book of Enoch was part of the study of Second Temple Judaism, of the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, of the background of early Christianity. The text had been one generation from being lost completely, several times. Real hands carried it when it was easier to set it down. Real minds believed it was worth the trouble of preservation. Whatever you make of the content of First Enoch, the survival is its own kind of remarkable. The book refused to disappear. Now let's resolve what we opened. What finally happens to Leviathan and Behemoth? Not a battle. We said so near the beginning of the night, and now we can say what it is instead. In the Enochic tradition, and in the rabbinic literature that developed from it through the Talmudic period, Texts like the Babylonian Talmud tractate Bava Batra, which engages extensively with Enochic material, Leviathan and Behemoth are described as having been kept, maintained in their separation for the whole of the age of the world, not killed at the beginning, not released into the world to be fought and defeated, kept, held, maintained in their addresses, she in the deep, he in the desert, for the entire history of creation. And at the end of time, at the great feast of the righteous, the celebration of the world to come, they are served. The two chaos creatures become the banquet. They are the food of the righteous at the eschatological meal, the great final gathering of those who endured the age of the world, who lived through the time when the chaos was contained rather than resolved. Leviathan and Behemoth are not the defeated enemies. They are not the prisoners finally executed. They are the feast. The chaos of the world, held for the whole of history, is in the end transformed into nourishment. This is so strange that it takes a moment to absorb. Let it be strange. The tradition that produced this ending was thinking about something very specific. If the chaos is not destroyed at the beginning, if the order of the world depends on the chaos being held rather than eliminated, then the chaos must be somewhere, must be doing something, must be, in some sense, maintained. And what does it mean for the great disorder to be maintained? It means it is still there, still present, still the danger it always was. And then, at the end, it is not overcome by force. It is not banished by divine fiat. It is transformed. It becomes the meal. The dangerous thing, held for all of time, is in the end made into food, taken into the body of the community that outlasted it, made part of the living rather than the threatening, integrated rather than expelled. The chaos is metabolized. The deep is digested. The world ends not with a battle but with a dinner party, and the main course is everything that was ever contained in the abyss. The image of the eschatological banquet is not unique to the Enochic rabbinic tradition. Across the ancient world, from Homer's account of the feasts of the gods to the Christian Last Supper, food appears at the boundary between the ordinary world and the world beyond it. Feasts are where the transition happens, where the human meets the divine, where the living and the dead briefly share a table. The idea that the great chaos creatures become the feast, that the dangerous things, the contained things, the things held apart for the whole of history, are in the end transformed into food, resonates with a pattern that appears to be nearly universal. What was threatening becomes nourishing. What was divided is finally brought to the table. The separation ends, not in the way the threat intended, not in chaos returning to overwhelm the world, but in the way the tradition imagined the world ought to end, with the dangerous thing made useful, made sustaining, made into the meal of those who endured. There is something very human in that ending. We take the things that frightened us, and, eventually, if we are fortunate, we eat them. Not literally, though in many traditions the consumption of a dangerous animal does carry a ritual weight, the idea that eating the creature absorbs its power. Metaphorically, the thing that loomed over the life, the thing that required management and maintenance and ongoing attention, becomes, at some point, just part of the story, part of what feeds you, part of the experience that made you capable of the banquet you're now sitting at. The chaos, in the end, is incorporated, not resolved, not explained, not understood in the sense the angel refused, but incorporated, taken into the community, taken into the body, made part of the ongoing life of those who outlasted it. The deep doesn't open its secrets, the locked door stays locked, but the thing behind the door, after all of history, becomes the food. This is, if you let it be, a very reassuring ending for a tradition that spent centuries trying to make sense of a world that kept coming apart. The Jews of the Second Temple period, who produced the Enochic texts, lived through the Babylonian exile, the Persian occupation, the Hellenistic period, the Maccabean revolt, the Roman occupation. Their world came apart, repeatedly, systematically, at the hands of one empire after another. And the tradition they built said, the chaos is real, it is being held, and at the end it becomes the feast. The thing that required holding becomes the thing that feeds. This is not a guarantee. It is not a prediction, it is the hope that the tradition articulates in cosmological form, that what is dangerous can be kept, and that keeping it has a purpose, and that the purpose is not punishment or imprisonment or the perpetual management of an insoluble problem. The purpose is the feast, the banquet of the righteous, the end of the age of maintenance, and the beginning of something the text doesn't describe further, something that has the shape of a meal, the shape of the community gathered, the shape of the chaos finally, quietly, metabolized. Whatever you think of that as theology, whether you hold it as literal eschatology, or read it as a structure of hope, it is a remarkable thing to say about the sea monster. Not defeated, not explained, fed to the righteous, given to the community that outlasted the age. The deep, in the end, feeds the world it was separated from at the beginning. The tradition of Leviathan and Behemoth as eschatological banquet is attested in multiple rabbinic sources, including the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Batra 74b 75a, which describes in some detail the feast of the righteous in the world to come and the role of the two creatures in it. Whether this tradition goes back to the original author of 1st Enoch chapter 60, or whether it developed in the centuries of commentary that followed, is a question the scholars continue to debate. What is not in doubt is that it is how the tradition thought about these creatures' end, and it is not what the structure of the story would seem to predict. The refusal. Let's resolve it properly now. The angel stands at the edge of chapter 60 and says, "Thou son of man, herein thou dost seek to know what is hidden." The reading that makes the most sense, given everything we've assembled tonight, is this. The deep is the part of creation that was never finished. It is the chaos that was contained rather than resolved, held rather than concluded. It is, in the language of cosmology, the remainder, the part of the original equation that can't be simplified, the part of the world that exists in a category outside the ordered categories. And the category of what exists outside the ordered categories is, by definition, the category of what cannot be known within the ordered categories. The angel is not protecting a terrible secret. The angel is pointing to a structural feature of the cosmos. The deep is what exists at and beyond the limit of the system. Knowing what the deep is, knowing fully, disclosing completely, would require standing outside the system to describe it. And there is no outside. There is only the ordered world, resting above the contained chaos, maintained by the division that founded it, proceeding through the days that the division makes possible. You cannot know what is in the deep because what is in the deep is what knowing runs on. The foundation cannot see itself from below. And then here is the honest modern rhyme, the one that brings the whole night together. 3/4 of the ocean floor is still unmapped tonight. The ship we started with, its lights on, its engines holding position, its sonar pulse going down, is drawing one thin line at a time on a chart that is mostly still blank. The Seabed 2030 project will continue its work for the rest of this decade, and when 2030 arrives, we may have mapped most of the floor, or we may have learned that the task is harder than expected and the blank spaces are wider than anticipated. We don't yet know. What we know is that right now, tonight, as you lie in whatever dark you've made for yourself, the ocean floor is mostly unknown, not metaphorically, not as a poetic gesture, actually, physically, technically unmapped, the largest habitat on this planet by volume, and we know it the way you know a city you've flown over at night, the outlines, the main lights, but not the streets, not the neighborhoods, not what's there when you actually get close. The ancient world drew a circle around what it knew and called the outer edge the sea monster's address. We drew a chart of the seafloor and called the blank spaces a technical problem to be solved. The gesture is the same. We are still, in the most literal sense possible, standing above the unmapped part. The fraction we know is a fraction. The deep remains. They were wrong about almost every detail. The creatures in the deep are not Leviathan. The springs at the bottom are not the fountains of the great Tehom in any supernatural sense. The brine pools do not contain a female monster of primordial chaos. What they contain is stranger than a monster, and more real, and in its strangeness almost as inaccessible to ordinary imagination. But they were right about the one thing that mattered. We still don't know. The deep keeps its counsel. The locked door, in the book and in the seafloor, is still locked. Whatever is down there has waited this long, in the cold and the pressure and the dark that no light has ever reached. In the brine pools with their preserved dead and their impossible shorelines. In the vents, where life invented itself without the sun. In the abyssal plains, where sediment has been falling in slow curtains since before the first human thought about falling asleep. It has waited this long. It can wait until morning. You've been down there now, all the way down and back. Let's come the rest of the way up. There's one last place the night needs to take you, and it's much closer than anything we've talked about. Everyone has a deep, not a metaphor you have to work to understand. Something you already know. There is something in your life, perhaps in you, perhaps in the history of how you became who you are, that was divided off at some point and put somewhere it couldn't reach the rest of you. Not destroyed. You know better than that. The difficult things are not so easy to destroy. They were contained, given an address, put somewhere safe, somewhere far enough from the daily order of your life that the days could proceed, somewhere quiet, in the dark, where they would do what contained things do, sit and wait, and occasionally make themselves known by the particular quality of silence they produce. Maybe it was a relationship that ended without ending, a friendship that dissolved, a love that changed shape, something that is technically over but occasionally surfaces in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, like a thermocline pressing upward. Maybe it was a version of yourself you left in a particular year of your life. A self who wanted something you stopped allowing yourself to want, who was something you outgrew or suppressed, or set carefully aside, because the daily world needed you to be something else. A self who is still there, in the deep place, waiting with the patience of something that has been there a long time. Maybe it was grief. Not all grief is portable. Not all of it comes in quantities the living can carry upright. And sometimes the only thing you can do with the largest kind is give it a room and say, not now, later, when I'm ready. And later arrives and you give it a longer lease, and the lease renews, and the grief is still down there being kept. The ancients understood this, not as psychology, the word didn't exist in any form they'd recognize, but as cosmology. They wrote it into the structure of the world itself, that the order which makes life possible is not the elimination of what is dangerous, but the containment of it. You don't kill the chaos. You divide it from the rest. You give it a place, the deep, the desert, the wilderness on the other side of the garden, and you keep it there, and the keeping is what makes the livable world possible. The angel won't tell you what's in the deep, because the deep is the thing the ordered world rests on. To fully know what's in it would be to fully understand the thing your understanding depends on. It can't be done from inside the system, so you acknowledge it. You mark the place on the map. You say, here is where I don't go. Here is where the tour doesn't take us. And then you go on living, with the locked door somewhere behind you, not forgotten, not unacknowledged, just not opened. The ancients would have recognized your arrangement perfectly. They built their whole cosmology around it. The chaos is real. It is being held. Most nights the holding is enough. There's a specific quality to the things we contain. They don't stay exactly as they were when we put them in the deep place. They change, slowly, in the dark. The sediment settles. The chemistry shifts. The thing you put away at 20 is not identical to the thing that surfaces, briefly, at 40. It has been altered by the time, by the pressure of everything above it. It comes up changed, sometimes unrecognizable, sometimes stranger and stranger than expected, sometimes, quietly, smaller. This is what the text doesn't quite say, but the tradition implies. The chaos is not static in its containment. It is being maintained. The separation requires ongoing maintenance. The world's order is not a state that was established once and then runs automatically. It is an ongoing act. The division is performed continuously, which is perhaps why the tradition imagines an angel keeping watch, not because the monsters would otherwise escape, but because the idea of containment requires an attention that is continuous, the way breathing is continuous, the way the heart is continuous, the way the body's immune system works continuously against the entropy that would otherwise dissolve it. You don't contain the deep once, you contain it every day, and on most days, that containment is invisible. You don't feel it happening. The days proceed, the order holds, and the thing in the deep is simply there, in its address, not requiring intervention. But some days the containment is visible. Some days you feel the weight of what you're holding, and you understand that the ordinary life proceeding above it is not the absence of the deep. It is the deep, contained. It is the order made possible by the separation. The ancients built their cosmology on this. They made it the structure of the world because it was the structure of their experience. The world is not the absence of chaos. The world is chaos, held, and the holding is the work. The ship holds its position. The pulse goes down, one thin line at a time. You don't need to resolve what's in your deep tonight. You don't need to open the door. You don't need to understand it, or explain it, or justify it to anyone, including yourself. The night is for something else. The night is for the stillness above the deep, the long surface of the contained water, carrying nothing tonight but the sound of a sonar pulse going down and coming back. Whatever is down there can wait. It has been waiting. It is very good at waiting. If tonight has been the kind of company you'd want again, the slow descent, the text and the sea floor and the stars, a quiet tap on the like button sends a signal into the algorithm, which learns what you wanted and tries to bring you more of it. You can do that now, if you're still awake. You can do it in the morning when you remember, or not at all. The algorithm will survive. Where in the world are you tonight? Leave it below. The city, the country, the hour, whatever you want. Someone in Reykjavik with the Arctic light already beginning to press at the edge of the curtains. Someone in Sao Paulo still hours from dawn. Someone in Osaka who has been asleep since the first 20 minutes and will read this tomorrow with the faint sense of having heard it already, in the dark, half dreaming. Leave it below. I read every single one in the mornings. The geography of the people who come here is one of the things I love most about this. If you want to keep coming back here, if this is a kind of night you want to be able to find reliably, the subscribe button keeps the channel close, and there is a membership for those who want a little more, a little deeper, a little more often. But honestly, you came here tonight. You stayed or you drifted and returned, which amounts to the same thing, watching and listening and resting here in the dark with me. That is already more than enough. Back to the ship. It's still out there. It hasn't moved. Why would it? The work is slow and the ocean is patient, and there are thousands of kilometers of unmapped seafloor still between this ship and the edge of what we know. The lights are on. The engines are holding position. A low, steady vibration, not quite sound, more a feeling in the soles of your feet if you're standing on the deck, which you're not, but you can imagine it. The pulse is still going down, one every several seconds, depending on the depth. Each one aimed at the floor below, each one coming back, slower than light, slower than thought, with one thin line of information that a machine transcribes into a map that almost no one will look at for months. Somewhere below the hull tonight, in the dark below the last light, below the midnight zone, below the Hadal, ridges that nobody has named yet, mountains that have never been photographed, that rise from plains that have never been mapped, that end in valleys that have never been sounded. The world below the world, going about its business in the permanent cold and dark, as it always has, as it was doing before the first fish crawled onto the first shore, as it will be doing after the last ship draws its last thin line across the blank. Brine pools with their shorelines, lying still in the abyssal dark, their surfaces smooth and clear, disturbed only by the slowest of currents, their edges marked by the preserved remains of creatures that came too close, bodies of water inside the water, fed by springs from below, resting on the floor of the sea the way a lake rests in a valley, in the dark and the cold and the absolute quiet. Vents where the planet breathes. Chimneys of precipitated mineral, built by centuries of hot fluid meeting cold ocean, surrounded by the blind white crabs and the slow waving tube worms and the carpet of mussels that owe the sun nothing, that have never needed it, that live on the chemistry of the Earth's interior, that are alive tonight in the total dark at the bottom of the world. And in a book written 2,000 years ago, in a language that almost nobody reads, preserved through centuries in the highlands of Ethiopia because a tradition believed it was worth keeping. In that book, in the 60th chapter, a guide stood at the edge of a question and declined to answer it. Thou son of man, herein thou dost seek to know what is hidden. The angel said no. And the ocean has been keeping its own counsel ever since. Whatever is down there has waited this long. In the dark below the dark, in the cold below the cold, in the place the sonar is still drawing its patient lines toward. It has waited through the whole of human history, through every civilization that built ships and sailed above it and guessed at what was underneath. It waited through the flood. It waited through the age of exploration. It waited while we developed the sonar and sent down the first cameras and found the first vents and named the first brine pools and gave the strangest one a name that admits what it does to the things that fall into it. It waited. It is waiting now. There is no urgency in the deep. There is only the cold and the dark and the slow accumulation of sediment, a centimetre every 1,000 years, the world recording itself in layers that no one will read. The deep can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest.